Okay, hey, I guess we're live here, guys. Robert Dakota, Worldviews Media. We're having our first podcast for Quest for Ancient Civilization, and we have no one less than William Henry and Randall Carlson with us tonight. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we might experience in Sedona. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to first start out with you guys sharing a little bit about what was your aha moment, or what brings you into this information and this research so deeply. What was the thing that said you're gonna dedicate the next 40 years to really diving into this?
You want to go first, William?
I'll be happy to. Thank you, Randall. And hello, Robert. Hello, Randall. Great to see you
Hello,
guys.
William. Good to
William?
see you as always.
Looking forward to Sedona on May 1st. It's going to be an amazing time. I 40 years ago, you're right, Robert. I was in my early 20s. I was living in Nashville. I just moved to Nashville, Music City from Detroit. I had planned to become an entertainment lawyer. I was a musician and all into that. And I thought, well, I'm going to get into the business side of the entertainment industry. And I happened to be at attending a small Southern Baptist college that had an entertainment music business program. We had professors. There was a kind of an experimental program, really weird, that we had, kind of these long hair musician types thrown in with these pretty uptight kind of Southern Baptists. And it was a hybrid kind of a thing, a real mashup. And we had professors that came over from Music Row that were our instructors. But because it was a Baptist college, we had to take Bible study classes. And I knew nothing about the Bible. I did not grow up in a religious household or a spiritual household. In our home, the four apostles were Waylon, Willie, Chris, and Johnny. And Rita Coolidge would have been the Mary Magdalene. Sunday morning church was Johnny Cash. And so I get into this environment where it's like I'm expected to know something about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and all of this. And I'm assigned to review a book whose implications would impact Christianity. Go to the local bookstore, find a new book, and write a 3-page review. Well, this is 1982. There was a brand new international bestseller called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Some might not be familiar with that book, but they are likely familiar with the Da Vinci Code, which 20 years later, Dan Brown adapted into a fictionalized novel or account of this that sold 85 million copies and counting. And I was instantly hooked because Holy Blood, Holy Grail said there's two parallel versions of Christianity. There's the traditional view, and then there's the more Gnostic view. And the traditional view decided it was going to exterminate the Gnostic view.
Mm-hmm.
And it called into question the basic tenets of Christianity. And I wrote a 44-page review of this book, and I was flunked. My professor sat me down, this kind of Texas Ranger type, sat down and said, literally, you believe this shit? And I'm like, because the premise of Holy Blood, Holy Grail was the crucifixion was a hoax. Jesus, Mary Magdalene were married. They had children. Their stuff is still buried somewhere, maybe in southern France. And they were all about this Gnostic awakening. Everybody's got this divine spark within them. They can awaken the divine spark, ascend into the heavens, become an angel, and all this, which is total heresy, especially in the buckle of the Bible Belt, Nashville, Tennessee, 1982. And so the professor's like, well, we think if you believe this crap that you might want to consider pursuing your education somewhere else. And I did. I became an autodidact. I was like, what happened here? Where's original Christianity gone? What was it? And can we recover it today? And what's all this business about human transformation into angelic type beings that they don't want us to know anything about? And that became like the power pack, the calling that I'm still working on answering 40 years later. So I'm very grateful for that initial awakening, which is what it was, and the opportunity then living in Nashville with the Vanderbilt University Divinity Library to not attend Vanderbilt, but to read all the books in their library. And that's what I did over a period of several decades, and continue my research up until today.
Yeah, fascinating how somebody trying to hold you back or putting obstacles in the way in your way can kind of reinforce your willpower to go even stronger and harder.
Yeah, such power pack in it. And I know that's a power pack. It's a something that attracts many people, these same questions that we're all so vitally interested in. Where do I come from? What am I doing here? And when it's time for me to leave, how do I go and where am I going and how am I going to get there?
Mm. Yeah. Randall, what was your aha huge moment, and what caused you to put you so deep in this path?
Well, that's a really hard question to answer, but I'll do the best I can. I've always been obsessively interested and curious about things, even as a kid. I can still remember one of my best birthday presents I got when I was 8 years old, when I pretty much just learned to read, was a subscription to the All About Book Club. So every month I would get sent out a book all about dinosaurs, all about electricity, all about whatever it might be, what all about, particularly actually remember there was one about the reptiles, and there was another one about the woolly mammoths. Not the woolly mammoths, but the megafauna. There was one about, I don't remember what it was called, but so yeah, 8, 9 years old there was that, and then we weren't. My mother's parents were very religious Southern Baptists, but we weren't. Both of my parents were very agnostic, but I think to assuage her parents, my grandparents, my mother would read us Bible stories when we were little. And I was quite fascinated by the whole panorama, and the whole story and the book we had that she would read from. And I'm, 5, 6, 7 years old, so I'm not really reading yet, but it had all the color plates and stuff in it, and I remember particularly being very fascinated, and I actually have a replica of it hanging in the bathroom wall. There was a painting there of Noah's Ark, right, and the flood. And that's the one that really stood out. And so somewhere along the line, I think my wife knew that I really liked that, and she saw a replica of that very painting from the book. She got it, hung it in the bathroom wall, and I go in there one day. This is probably 25 years ago now, and I think it still hangs there. Anyways, so there was a lot of little incremental steps going along. We had a major movement, so I would definitely have to attribute part of my whole overall consciousness and worldview to the fact that we lived a rural life out in rural Minnesota. We had a little bit of land on the shores of a glacial meltwater lake. And virtually all of our neighbors were farmers. My best friend growing up was a kid my age who was the youngest boy of a nearby farm family. So I was immersed in agricultural growing up and having that rural existence. So from very early on, probably by the time I was 5 or 6 years old, I'd been out with my dad. I learned to find the North Star, the Big Dipper, Orion, and I think that was a big important part of it was having that rural existence. And then my parents got divorced when I was 9. My mother moved us from rural Minnesota to small town Louisiana,
Wow.
which was a very kind of a culture shock. But what I remember was that it was a brand new school. I think it was Pineville Grammar, and I think my 4th grade was when I was there. It had just opened, and they had spent a lot of extra money to do a really nice library, a deluxe library. And I remember going into the library and discovering books on Greek and Norse mythology, and got just completely immersed in mythology there for that, like in my 4th grade. There was 3 or 4 books probably on each one, and I went through all of them, poured through them, and that was another very important incremental step. So I had the exposure to the Bible stories and the Greek mythology and the Norse mythology, and I remember still being just like, God, what is this? Ragnarok and the Midgard serpent and the Fenris wolf, and I'm having all this imagery. It almost kind of scared me in a way. Of course, now later I have a different perspective on all of that. But then, then coming up, I came of age, young man just out of high school, last, 68, 69, right during the peak of all of that. And of course, I ended up getting immersed in that and did the whole route, psychedelics and all of that for a couple of years, and was profoundly influenced by that. And I quickly discovered that, I went from my first psychedelic experience in the fall of 1968, not having the slightest idea what to expect. And by this time, I'm 17 years old. My primary interest in life at that point was, well, okay, girls. Okay, that was my thing at 17. I did an LSD trip and basically had a religious experience and a religious awakening, and at 17. And uh, I remember not long. I like this was not what I expected. I don't know what I was expecting, but it was totally not what I expected. So I remember there was a book called LSD and the Search for God.
Hmm.
And I got that shortly after that first, this would have been fall of 1968. And I just poured through that book, and it had lots of references. It referenced Eastern literature. And that was what launched me into this whole study of, everything. We didn't call it entheogens back then, but I went through a period and had some really awesome peyote trips that I managed to somehow sneak in there. And then everything went bad. Nixon became president, uh, and he ramped up the drug war, and not enough people were overdosing and going to the hospital. So I have the word on the street was they're putting bad stuff out to try to get people to OD and go to the emergency room and all of that. So I quit everything pretty much, and right around that time, I uh, I met a Brahmin priest who was a Sanskrit professor at the University of Minnesota, and he was teaching meditation. This would have been 1971, and that's when I kind of shifted into following a spiritual path. So at that point, I began to immerse myself in Eastern philosophy. I read the Mahabharata and Upanishads and Vedic literature and immersed. Just I'm sure, like you did too, William. You immersed yourself in a lot of that. But there was a couple of points. I'll say, summer of 1969, there was they used to have rock concerts out on the bluffs overlooking the Minnesota River Valley, just south of Minneapolis. And it was open air and it was free. And they had a stage set up just next to the little Flying Cloud Airport at Eden Prairie was the name of the place, Eden Prairie. And I recall this quite clearly, that there was a break in the music, and I wandered off over to the edge of the bluffs. And I was standing there. These are 200-foot high bluffs. You go down, and there are a couple of miles on the other side. There's a corresponding set of bluffs. And I remember standing there looking down and seeing the modern Minnesota River, this small river meandering down on the floor of this big valley. And it was entrenched into the what I now know as alluvium of the valley floor. And I had this first sense, before I even knew the term scale invariance, in the sense that I could see these two embankments that the river was flowing in. And I had this overwhelming sense that this big valley, a couple of miles wide, with 200-foot bluffs on the other side, was a larger scale version of what I was looking at down, you know, just below me. So that idea didn't like trigger anything immediately, but it marinated in my mind for 5 or 6 or 7 years when coming roundabout, uh, I read books like Velikovsky and books, Pole Shift. Charles Hapgood's work was out by 76, 77, I think. So I was now, and because reading mythology, I mean, you cannot read mythology and not see the importance of the whole catastrophism element in there. Deucalion and the flood, Phaeton. What I mentioned earlier. The Ragnarok. All of it,
Mhm.
and of course, as I expanded my reading into a broader spectrum of mythology, that's when I really realized, well, wow, this is. I had no idea that they told this flood story in over 100 different cultural accounts, right? That was 76, 77, right in there that I began to like, and of course, at that point, I go, okay, I'm thinking back to this time I'm standing on the bluff, right? And I'm thinking, oh, I wonder. maybe I was onto something. Maybe that premonition or that instinct that I had, maybe there was something to it. Now, subsequent research, yes, there was something to it. In fact, I discovered, probably in the mid to late 80s, I actually found a paper about the Minnesota River and the history, and they said it's the remnant of glacial river warren, which was from the catastrophic outflow of gigantic inland sea, Lake Agassiz. And when I took Graham Hancock on the tour, when he was researching Magicians of the Gods, we stopped at that outlet at the southern end of Lake Agassiz, which of course isn't there anymore. But if you look at a map of Minnesota, you see this odd bump like a wart on its western border, right? And I always, as a kid, would see that and go, why didn't they just make it straight? Why is that bump there? Well, the bump actually defines the catastrophic outburst of Lake Agassiz. So we stopped there. There's a lake there called Big Stone Lake. Guess why it's called Big Stone Lake? Well, because there's a whole big pile of big stones there. Anyways, I guess what I'm getting at here is that Great Glacial River Warren, the paleohydrologist that studied it, went in there and he was able to calculate the peak discharge. And it was 4,000 times greater than the flow of the modern Minnesota River. So my original impression that I had was the realization hit me. Yeah, that impression was right on. I was having this sense that there was this gigantic river, 2 to 3 miles wide and 200 feet deep flowing through there. And there was. So, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation here. But that's kind of how it led in. And then, like you, William, I discovered Holy Blood, Holy Grail and read it. At the time I read it, it was probably around the time I would think I read it. It was not long after it came out, because actually I have a hardcover copy of the original. And finally by, I think 89, I had the wherewithal. So I went and spent a couple of weeks in Europe, in France and northern Spain, with Holy Blood, Holy Grail, following as many of those sites that I could find that he talked about in there. So I hit, of course, I'd already studied about Chartres Cathedral and Reims and Amiens. They were the 3 big cathedrals I visited. Lourdes, where the Marinette apparition occurred, quite a place. Montsegur, which was the last holdout of the Cathars. You hadn't climbed up there. A bunch of other Ande, the little town on the Basque Country on the Atlantic Ocean, where the Ande stone. Jay Widener has written about that, which is I think you're muted, William, maybe, or your mouth moved and no words came out. If you got a comment, I want to hear. Okay, I think I heard you. Let's see.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Yeah,
That
is
is
the ball for a second, William, because you looked like you were. Yeah.
no, that's so cool. You got to do that like in the mid 80s or so, or late 80s, when it was still the pre-Dan Brown era. I think I went there first time in 1996. It was still
Yeah.
this sleepy village the way it had been for hundreds of years. And then all of a sudden there was this massive explosion that was about to happen of tourism in that area. But that's so cool, Randall. And I just got to ask you, when did you become a musician too?
Oh, well, my mother played piano, and I tried to play as a kid. And then after the divorce, and we moved because we had a piano as a kid. But when I was always interested in percussion too, so I was always beating on stuff. And then right after I got to Georgia in 1974, I started studying with Adnan Muhammad El Sarhan, who was Naqshbandi and Mevlevi dervish, and he was a percussionist, and his whole thing was that he taught the whirling.
Yeah.
So for a couple of years, I was a whirling dervish.
No
74,
way. Oh
76.
my gosh. Wow.
Yes, that was interesting. So he when you whirl, you don't just you're not just randomly whirling. There's a whole procedure. Otherwise, you get very dizzy very quick and you fall down. and you create a chain reaction catastrophe, which actually did happen. You've got a room full of people and they're all whirling, and all it takes is one. All it takes is one. And it happened to me on more than a couple occasions, and I remember these like for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, struggling my utmost to maintain my equilibrium. And then finally, you just lose it. And then all it takes is a little bump into your neighbor, and then now they're struggling. And it is literally a chain reaction that goes around the room, and pretty soon everybody's on the floor. Now, of course, we're novices, right? But my point is that Adnan played a doumbek, and he had trance rhythms, and the tempo of the trance rhythms determined how fast we would whirl. Pick up the tempo, we'd whirl faster. Slow down the tempo. And I got so interested in that, I actually purchased a hammered copper drum with a goat skin on it through Adnan. He got one imported, or had some imported, I don't remember. But so I bought one, and I took my first lessons from him. And that would have been 1974. And then I found other teachers. Ibrahim Turman, he was a percussionist from Turkey. And then there was Mary Ellen Donald, who was a darbuka or doumbek player out on the West Coast, quite well known back then. So then I met up with other musicians, and one of them had been studying Middle Eastern music. He played the oud. And we formed a band for a couple of years, 80, 81, 82, performed all over Atlanta. We hooked up with all of the belly dancers. And then I realized that I learned, belly dancing is a language. Everything, every movement is like a letter of an alphabet, and they tell a whole story. And, the drumming would go with that. So that's kind of how I got into that. That was how
Love it.
Yeah. So looking forward to maybe we do some percussion, some trance drumming out in Sedona. Is that okay?
There you go. That'd be nice. Love it.
Okay. Now you're a music, William, right? Or you were studying music?
Yeah, I play guitar. I write my own music. Just love it.
Okay.
It's just a way of connecting and bringing in the vibe.
Okay.
So the common theme there seems to be everybody's been looking into and reading, studying a lot of books.
Mm-hmm.
And the other common thread seems to be entheogens. I can say and confirm I'm like in there with you guys on the books and the entheogens. Also, the experience, the direct experience in the field at the locations where things are happening seems to be a common thread as well. These days with people searching and wanting to connect, wanting to, have something to have faith in, how is this information and, specifically for you, William, how is this sacred architecture and the myth, how is that? It seems like there's something encoded there, and it seems like it's directed to speak to the human soul. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Absolutely, Robert. Now, this is, I think, what calls people into this work, into this area of interest. They're looking to answer a question that they have deep in their soul. It could be among the questions I posed a moment ago. Who are we? Where do we come from? What am I doing here? When it's time to leave, where am I going? How am I going to get there? These are the really big questions that people start to lock onto. And they recognize that many of the myths are actually pathways. They're coded pathways that start us to answer those questions. And they trigger even more questions based upon our level of understanding. I mean, you can read a story in one point in your life and then 10 years later come back to it, it's got a whole new level of meaning, or there's a new revelation that's waiting there. And this is part of the beauty of these gatherings, is that, and this is one thing I love about these gatherings, like the Quest for Ancient Civilizations, is it's bringing people together who all are united around the same idea. There's no real dogma. there's nothing but questions. There's investigating. There's enthusiasm for not only the past but also the future, because we have a sense that as we bring this knowledge forward, it's going to bring not only a new revelation, but it's going to bring a higher pathway forward for all of us.
Well, it seems like I've observed a lot of connections and networking and people getting together, and those bonds and friendships and relationships spreading out,
Yeah.
and they go out in ways that you don't recognize. But that core interest, like you said, who are we, where are we going, and where do we come from? It seems to be, innate to everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And so when you're in a group of people, large group of people, especially at like these events, wow, the energy is palpable, the frequency is elevated, and it's an opportunity, for people to say yes to themselves, really. You're not just attending an event. You're saying yes to a deep part of yourself that is wanting to be fed, that's hungry. And this is the best way that I know to feed that hunger, because you're going to be talking with people like Randall. My gosh, he's a walking encyclopedia of not only the past 50 years of history with experience, but also his expertise in geology and all of those questions. So, it's an opportunity to come face to face with new friends, but also people that have already taken many of the steps that you've taken, can help you maybe save a couple of steps or guide you on where to go from here.
Hmm. Yeah, I like how when everyone's putting out their information and what they discovered, that gives the opportunity for connecting the dots from different perspectives and seeing, oh, hey, there's a relationship between astronomy and what's going on the ground to where these placing these things. There's a relationship with the symmetry and sacred geometry, which requires architecture, and that requires a plan, Um, so, Randall, with your work in catastrophic cycles, how were the ancients, encoding something for our human consciousness from their human consciousness? Because it seems like they were prepping and preparing and knowing about these coming cycles.
Well, the magic word, cycles. And I think that they were very much, I mean, one thing is clear. Ancient peoples all over the world were almost obsessive about tracking the movements of the heavens, knowing what's happening in the sky and in the celestial realm. And I think there's multiple reasons for that. Obviously, because I think that just the more intimately our own consciousness is connected with the higher realms that are manifesting to us through the greater universe, the more aware, the more conscious we're going to be of the whole grand scheme of things, of which we are an intimate part. But clearly, I think it did have to do with the cyclical nature of time, because unlike in a Judeo-Christian tradition, you can almost think of time as being linear from the creation of the world, the establishment of the Garden of Eden, the first humans, up to Armageddon and the apocalypse, is and the rapture. All of that is a line, right, with a definite beginning and a definite end. Whereas in the archaic models of time, it is cyclic, and what goes around comes around. And the idea is that you aren't really an exact repetition each cycle, but there are very strong correlations and parallels. I just use the analogy of think about our own annual cycle around the sun. So I'm here in Georgia, it's in rural Minnesota. And of course, one of the questions is okay, when we know that probably sometime around late October, early November, we'll have the first freeze of the year. And sometimes around, late March, usually into April, we'll have the big thaw. And as kids, we always loved the big thaw because there was, when the snow is melting away and, you've been locked in the frozen snow and now it's all melting away and it creates all kinds of flooding and streams that are running but so if you look at what my point is that there is, even though the cycle, you can make a prediction. If you're sitting there and it's February or now it's March, I can say with a high degree of confidence that 3 months from now, it's going to be warmer. and the northern hemisphere. And that warmth is going to be associated with something we can see definitely happening in the sky, which translates to the earth, because the length of the day is changing. The length of the day is now getting longer, and it will continue to get longer until June 21st. And then it'll start getting shorter again. And we notice that that is associated with a changing pattern in the heavens. The position of the sun along the horizon is moving. It's swinging in this like great pendulum through the course of an annual cycle. Well, from the basis of that, we can make fairly accurate predictions. Now, I can't say, okay, the first day that it's gonna go below freezing, like here in Georgia, it's like you want to know that because you're gonna go out and cover your plants, right? So you want to know what's going to be the first day that the temperature at night goes below freezing. Well, pretty much you've got a window of a couple of weeks, and it's almost certain that it's going to be within that window, but you don't know the exact day, see? So you got to pay attention to all the signs, etc. And as you get closer to that moment, you're going to be able to identify, okay, and of course now we have we have the weatherman to tell us, or the weather lady, as the case may be, to tell us, okay, you better cover your plants tonight because it's going to get down to 28 degrees, right? Or warning, let your faucets drip because it's going below freezing tonight, right? But our ancestors could observe the signs of nature and discern the same information, basically. And they would take precautions to do what needed to be done. Well, in the archaic models of time, we have this scale invariant phenomena. We can look at the cycle of a day, and there's analogy between the diurnal cycle of a day and the annual cycle of the year. But then there's a greater cycle, the great year, and it's that great year that's embedded in the zodiacal wheel. And that zodiacal wheel is the cosmic clock that tells us when things are going to happen, not to the exact date, but within a range, right? Just like we've got the 12-month calendar, and it tells us by reference when certain things are going to happen. We got the 12 hours on the clock, and we know, okay, the sun is going down later every night, so I've now got more time to do my evening walk, or it's going to change, right? So we're governing a section of our life based around orienting around the diurnal cycle, which is the turn on the axis. We organize our life on the annual cycle from the perspective of a civilization that could potentially endure for thousands of years. You have to be cognizant of that greater cycle. And I think that was what the prophets and the holy men and women were very much in tune with that. They knew the grander cycles. And in fact, I believe that many cultures had traditions of, if you want to call them a priesthood or whatever you characterize them, whose job it was to monitor activity in the heavens, monitor the cycles from generation to generation to generation. And the mythic stories often were embedded within that. That's the whole premise of Hamlet's Mill, that book that I always recommend everyone to read if they want to get into the idea that there was an archaic knowledge of time that was far more sophisticated than had been acknowledged up to that point, 1969, by conventional scholarship. And I think that it's embedded in that knowledge of the greater cycles that were derived from direct experience and the memories of things that happened. And William, do you know the term lurking variable?
No.
This is a good term to know. A lurking
Okay.
variable, and you're doing a statistical analysis of anything. You've got a bunch of data points you throw in there. And let's say you're dating something and you get a big cluster of dates and they're all around the same period of time. It looks like, looks like this, whatever they were doing here, this encampment was 200 years ago. But then you got a couple of data points where this one goes 500 years ago and this one says 25 years ago. Those are outliers, and you say, okay, something's not right there, so you throw out the outliers, right? And you don't factor them into your central core. That's what gives you the bell curve. Most of the stuff is at the top of the bell curve here, and then you got the tails, right? So you generally throw out that. except once in a while you get what's called the lurking variable. And what that means is that, and because when you throw out, the outliers, it usually doesn't, it's assumed it's not affecting the outcome of your equation and your statistical analysis.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's a lurking variable that if you factor that into your equation, it completely changes the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
It's lurking off on the sidelines, see? And if you ignore it, you're not really going to get an accurate analysis, see?
Mm-hmm.
But if you include that lurking variable, boom, the outcome of your equation completely different. So I'm always looking for those lurking variables.
Very cool.
Here's an example of what I think is a great lurking variable. In Plato's Timaeus and Critias, where he's talking about Atlantis and the 9,000 years of that the sacred registers recorded these great events. 9,000 years was the lapse of time, according to the sacred registers, from the Great War between the Proto-Athenians and the Atlanteans and the subsidence of Atlantis, the destruction of Atlantis, and Solon's presence there with the priesthood who are conveying this to him. Well, Solon's journey to Egypt was 600 BC. So all you got to do is you do the math and you get 11,600. And I think you and I have probably talked about this before. That date, as it turns out, was embedded in Plato's dialogues for 2,300 years. And now we have, coincidentally, meltwater pulse 1b. We've got the rapid sudden termination of the Younger Dryas. We've got the transition from the Pleistocene epoch to the Holocene epoch. All of these things converging right on Plato's date. Coincidence? I think not. I think that date of his was there in the literature for hundreds of years as a lurking variable. And if we include it and we go, this is not a coincidence, that alone to me changes the whole outcome of the equation.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Beautiful.
You got to unmute yourself, Rob. Bert.
Myself.
Sorry.
Another thing I'm noticing that has, everything in common here is transformation. So all these different elements bringing transformation, and we know about Brian Maruscu's book, The Eternity Key.
Immortality Key.
Immortality Key. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings in the story of the mystery schools and Eleusinian. William, since you've been decoding the Gnostics for more than 30 years, for people who might not know, what were the Gnostics actually about? Because, we have both good and bad. We hear both good and bad stories about the Gnostics. Can you fill us in on some details there?
Yeah. So the word Gnostic means to awaken inner knowing, as opposed to reading a text like the Bible. You're going within. And the fundamental premise of the whole Gnostic idea was that we have a divine spark within us that's not native to this world. It comes from another layer of creation. You can almost use the contemporary word simulation, because that's a lot of people are using the Gnostic cosmology and Gnostic viewpoint to explain our essential predicament right now relative to simulation theory. So the Gnostics are saying you have this divine spark. It's not the totality of yourself. It's a fragment of your true self. Your true self remains in the pleroma, in a higher realm, in a perfect state. And so this aspect of yourself, this divine spark, this seed, they sometimes refer to it as a seed, incarnates on earth, manifests the physical flesh and blood body as a vehicle for exploring in this layer. And its quest is to attain knowledge and ultimately to return to its source place. They have stories like the hymn of the robe the hymn of the robe of glory, or the hymn of the pearl, and it essentially encapsulates the Gnostic concept that you come from this divine realm, but you can't stay there, because the soul's essential raison d'etre is to explore. And so we get sort of kicked out of heaven in a way, guided by a wiser part of ourself, or perhaps even another entity. We incarnate on earth, and part of our quest is to remember this divine aspect of ourselves, this divine pearl or this seed, this divine spark. And if we go with the spark analogy, the idea is to fan it into a flame, and that represents the awakening. So you'll see imagery in Christian art where they've got flames coming out of the top of their heads because they've ignited that divine spark within. And ultimately, getting back to the hymn of the robe of glory, or the hymn of the pearl, once we acquire this pearl, which requires a search, an exploration, and a conflict or a challenge with a dragon that guards that pearl, then we reclaim our true divine self. We put on our robe of glory, and we're able then to return to our source place. So along the way, the Gnostics were utilizing various prayers, meditations, even divine substances, entheogens we call them today, that awaken the divine within. These are natural substances, everything from Amanita muscaria mushrooms to psilocybin mushrooms to ergot, which was something Brian wrote about in his book as being quite prevalent in the ancient world, an early form of LSD before it was synthesized, that lifted the veil, enabled us to peer beyond into the real world. Because another facet of the Gnostic philosophy is that this is not the real world. None of this is real. This body is not real. It's an illusion. It's a Buddhist concept too. And that we need to learn to see beyond the physical. We call that the quantum realm today, and adopt that spiritual view. So the Gnostic view was about discovering that divine spark within ourselves, that seed, that pearl, and beginning the path towards ascension. But ultimately, it was also a recognition, at least within Gnostic Christianity, that Jesus was the one that came to awaken these divine sparks, and to awaken these seeds, and to assist us in our, not only our awakening, but our journey home. And so within Christianity, you have the traditional, they call it the red letter gospels. These are supposed to be the texts that characterize what Jesus spoke while incarnate in a body. But the Gnostic gospels are completely different. They talk about the afterlife journey. It's Jesus returning after the resurrection and ascension, giving the disciples, especially Mary Magdalene, foremost Mary Magdalene, instructions on how to navigate the afterworld, the winding waterways of the halls of Amenti of ancient Egypt. And all of these concepts start to come together. The Native American path of souls, all of this has been mapped out for us by previous generations, and it's essentially Gnostic in its character.
I remember once you also said that the original Christians said that their purpose here as humans was to transform themselves into angels.
Yeah, this is the real nugget or gem within the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were not known. The Gnostic Gospels weren't known until 1945. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered 2 years later, 1947. So in the early 1950s, for the first time in 1,500 years or more, 1,900 years actually, since the time of Jesus, we are now getting access to the original source documents that were used by potentially the disciples. I mean, literally, some people believe Jesus's fingerprints could be on the Dead Sea Scrolls, that he actually utilized those texts. The Book of Enoch is one of the primary texts that was in that cache. And it explicitly tells about Enoch, who's a pre-flood figure, first man to ascend, according to the book of Genesis. Enoch walked with God, first human to ascend. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they talk about the sacred technology that was, as I term it, that was utilized in that transformation. The Archangel Michael anointed Enoch's body with an oil that dissolved his body into its energetic essence, its originally divine essence, so that now Enoch was exactly the same as the angels in his appearance. And then Enoch transforms ultimately into a next level human, a transhuman named Metatron, whose name means beyond the throne. And now Enoch, as Metatron, becomes the guide for all of humanity, and the cycle starts all over again.
So fascinating, and it's all connected. Speaking of Metatron, Randall, you come at this from a completely different angle with sacred geometry, Freemasonry, mathematical architecture of ancient knowledge. What would you say about this era, the Gnostic revival, and what does Gnosis mean to you?
Well, it very much the distinction for me, and I think, and I was getting this from what William was saying, is that the Gnostic tradition was personal, experiential, direct experience of knowledge, whereas traditional organized religions became more about dogmas and an authoritarian tradition of knowledge propagation, which has value, but it needs to be correlated with the inner experience. And I think there was kind of a division that happened where, with the establishment of the authoritarian church, your focus was supposed to be on the external hierarchy and not the internal. And I think that would be kind of the major difference between that. And William is absolutely right. We in the rediscoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library and other of the apocryphal texts that we've had access to, say even since the 1800s, but we have this totally altered perspective on the origin of Christianity, which I think is very, very different than the conventional models. And I'm not invested in dogmas about it, because I guess the way I was raised, I was not inculcated in this is what this means and this is all that it means right here, right? Because I remember very early on going, wait a minute now, in the Bible stories, wait a minute, Adam and Eve were the first people, and then they had, and I'm like probably 8 years old or something, and and then they had kids, and then Cain was bad and he killed Abel and got kicked out, and he went to this place called the land of Nod and got a wife. Wait. Something, what there's another backstory here, I think, that kind of has been overlooked. And, those kinds of things just, never set quite right with me. And I'm still that way. I'm still like, okay, there's things here that don't really seem to make sense a whole lot. Particularly, even in the synoptic gospels themselves, there's stuff that seems to suggest something going on behind the scenes, that there's a whole nother dimension or level to this story. If I could, like, just maybe even do a quote here to give an example of what I mean here. Let's see if I can get to, let's see. Okay, so this is from the book of Mark, 14th chapter. And this is on the eve of the day before the Passover. So, the Passover was the Last Supper that they all held. They gathered together, and they did the ritual, the drinking of the Eucharistic ritual. And then, of course, Jesus, from that point on, then he went out and suffered the passion of the crucifixion and all of that. But so here's just, like, this is from the King James of 14th chapter of Mark. And the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed or sacrificed for the Passover, his disciples said unto him, where wilt thou that we go and prepare, that thou may eat the Passover? So Jesus is what Jesus does. He sendeth forth two of his disciples, and saith unto them, go ye into the city, and there you'll meet a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him. And wheresoever he shall go in, then say ye unto the good man of the house, our master said, where is the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us. This whole thing has been laid out. ahead of time, right? They're told, go into the city and you're looking for a guy who's you'll recognize him because he's got a water pitcher, right? So you go to that guy bearing the water pitcher and you give him a certain key phrase so that he knows who you are. Then he will take you to the house where it's already prepared. Now, there's a backstory there. And it's not giving us the details. Somebody prepared that. Who was the guy with the water pitcher? Who was the good man of the house? Well, according to some traditions, it was none other than Joseph of Arimathea himself. And you can go to the right there in the Gospels. It says Joseph of Arimathea. It describes him as, exact words in the King James, a secret disciple of Christ. Wait a minute. Time out. Wait a minute. So in addition to the original 12, there was a secret one? Oh, and then there was Nicodemus, sort of his partner in crime, who was described as who was a disciple by night. Okay, who are these guys? And how many more of them? Did he have other secret disciples? That was the immediate question in my mind. How many of these secret disciples were there? So you start asking these questions and you suddenly realize, yeah, there's a whole nother series of events happening off the stage. And to me, that's what's really the interesting part to me. And when you look at conventional Christian theology, the main focus is the Christ of faith. But what's getting lost in all of that is the Jesus of history. So let's assume he was real. There was a real guy, right? Whatever his backstory is, he's a real guy. Maybe he is the Son of God, literally, whatever that means, although he never described himself as the Son of God. In reference to himself, he was the Son of Man, which to me almost says, I'm a man. But maybe I have unusual possibilities. Maybe something, we use the word transformation, or maybe a better word would be transmutation. He was obviously special in some way, right? So then what unfolds, and of course, because you were also a student of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, it follows from there that, yeah, there's indications that the whole crucifixion was a ritualized presentation of some kind, probably had its roots much, much earlier in the whole cycle, the great cycles, which involved the sacrifice of the divine king, which was mirrored in the heavens by the 20-year cycle of Jupiter eclipsing Saturn every 20 years when Jupiter, the young king, displaced Saturn, the old king. My point, I think, is that, clearly, even just the conventional Gospels themselves contain all kinds of hints that there's more to this story. Like, okay, so what do we know about the life of Jesus? We know that, he was born in Bethlehem. They fled to Egypt to avoid the killing of the firstborn. And then we find this one anecdote in one of the books. He's in Egypt at 12 years old. He gets lost. They find him in the temple discoursing with the elders. Then what do we know about him for the next 18 years?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. Now, arguably, he's the most important individual in Western history, and nobody thought, we need to do a biography on Jesus. We need to. No, I mean, where is it? See, that's been a question in my mind for literally decades. Well, where did he go? Who did he know?
Right.
Did he stop?
Right.
Yeah, and I'm sure, William, I have no doubt you've had the same questions.
Oh yeah, definitely. And Randall, you'll be happy to know, and this might be my topic at the conference in May in Sedona. I'm releasing my new book. It's called The Psychedelic Christ, the Lost Dose of the Son of Man. And it actually opens with the story of Nicodemus and his transformation of a secret disciple that meets Jesus at night, pretends he doesn't even know what Jesus is talking about. And Jesus is like, how could you be a leader of the Sanhedrin and not know what the concept of being born again from above means. And that kind of kicks off my whole investigation into the possibility, which I think the probability, the reality of a lost sacrament, an entheogenic, a psychedelic sacrament that awakened the consciousness of the disciples. And in the case of Nicodemus, he went from this unknowing or seemingly unknowing figure to an all-in disciple who accompanied Joseph of Arimathea on Easter morning, bringing the 100 pounds of aloe and myrrh that's going to prepare the body for Jesus's resurrection and ascension. And I'm personally convinced, uh, based on the research I did in the book, that there was a lost dose of the Son of Man. And you mentioned that title. Jesus never called himself the Christ or Messiah. He called himself the Son of Man.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was a polysemic term. It was multi-layered. It referred to a cosmic axis, the ladder or stairway to heaven that the angels ascended and descended upon. That was the Son of Man. The Son of Man is a title for Jesus. The Son of Man is a humble term. I'm just a guy. The Son of Man is also an edible that was passed among the disciples. I believe it was the hallucinogenic manna that the Israelites fed on for 40 years in their wandering of the wilderness, and Jesus recovered some of this. And when he fed the 5,000 with a single loaf of bread, they were able to do that because they were microdosing this hallucinogenic substance. This is why the 5,000 go into this incredible spirit of ecstasy and are connecting with this higher realm. And this is why the Israelite high priests flipped their lid when this happened, because they knew that of the messianic prophecy that when the Messiah comes, he will bring that manna back and will reintroduce it. And it was an integral part of a whole kit of tools that included actually the Ark of the Covenant. And I think that was their great fear, that if this Yeshua or Jesus character, this hippie from the Galilee, is showing up and microdosing people with the manna, the hallucinogenic star food, and they're going into these ecstatic states, then that must infer that he also possessed the rest of the Ark of the Covenant as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to have to take a moment to process that. Let me see. Let's see.
I would love to send you a copy of my book. It's going to be
I
out
would
just
love to read your book.
Okay.
I would love to read it and then feature and then write a book review of it.
Oh, please. Oh my gosh, I would love that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then put a link. I just got through. I've been reading and learning about regenerative agriculture, and I went and visited Will Harris at his farm. Like it says, one farm, 6 generations in the future of food. So I wrote a long, extended analysis and review of this book. We're going to put it for sale on the website. And but what I came away with it was the whole idea of regeneration and seeing the parallels between what he's doing there with the land. And it just drives home this point. The secret of the Grail is that the king and the land are one. The king being the representative of humanity, right? Who's the stand-in for humanity. And what regenerates the land regenerates the person, the human. That was my takeaway from what he's doing. I don't even know if he thinks in those terms, but I suspect he does. But that was my takeaway from it. And thinking, what he's doing there, the principles that he's implementing on his land down there in Bluffton, Georgia, are an analogy for, in a way, what needs to happen across the spectrum of our whole society. He talks about the three ugly sisters, the trifecta of like industrial farming. And the last of those is centralization. The second one is commodification, but the last one, centralization, is kind of what has happened. We've got now centralized healthcare, we've got centralized education, we've got centralized industrial farming. We've seen how vulnerable things can be. Like during COVID gave us a little wake-up call, because we saw, for example, I remember well, going into the grocery stores and seeing lines and lines of empty shelves. Why?
Yeah.
Because there had been a break in the supply chain.
Yeah.
Well, that is not nearly as critically important to the functioning of a regenerative system, because the regenerative system does not rely on the external inputs to the same extent that an industrial system does. And the outputs, most in a regenerative system, most of the outputs are recycled into the farm, into the entity, right? Well, what I'm getting at is I think there's a spectrum of applications there that apply to the individual, that the potential of regenerating ourselves, regenerating our land and the food we eat, but also regenerating the instruments or elements of our society, which to me is just very much about what the work needs to be in the coming years and decades, is that we need to alter our thinking and our approach, because we're seeing even in our political sector this extreme centralization. And what happens in nature itself builds in redundancies in everything it does. And we're getting in a system now that is filled with vulnerabilities. And right now, okay, so if there's a blockage of the Straits of Hormuz, it could affect us drastically over here on the other side of the world. But in the regenerative system, you're going to be surrounded. Will Harris uses the term bubbles, other systems, other regenerative farms, and they can mutually reinforce each other. If there's catastrophe, like he describes it in 2018, when Hurricane Michael came through, it really devastated their farm, right? And cost him over $1 million in damages. But even then, he was able to turn for assistance from the burgeoning movement of regenerative farms that were emerging at that point. And now, since 2018, we're looking at 7 and 8 years later. This is a movement that's happening across the country now, and this farm, White Oaks Pastures in South Georgia, is one of the leading lights. And this book, I cannot recommend it highly enough, because as gruff as he is and as close to the land and the southern, he's a very spiritual man. And so I'm very much about how do we take these principles of transformation and not only apply them to ourselves as individuals, but how can we transform society? How can we shift our priorities? Because we cannot proceed along this path indefinitely that we're moving down without, and all of the prophecies give it to us. If you follow this path, the end result is going to be chaos. It's going to be oblivion. It's going to be Armageddon. But there's another way. There's a holy city that the blueprint has been given to us through the sacred traditions of the ages. And the piece that you said, the word remember, well, we're remembering that which has been lost for millennia. And we're bringing it back together. And what we're realizing is that we have been given a blueprint for creating literally the holy city, which is where we need to be going. That's the direction we need to go. But we won't be moving that way until people begin to understand that such a thing even exists, that there's this richer, deeper tradition that we are privileged to be to have as a legacy available to us now in ways right now to our generations that are alive on the earth today that have been unprecedented in thousands of years. So we have this tremendous opportunity right now because we have access to so many of the pieces of the members to remember. And I think that's ultimately, Robert, why this coming together, like what we're going to be doing in Sedona, is so important. Because it's extremely valuable that we can sit here and talk to each other. You're in Colorado, right, William?
I'm in Phoenix.
Oh, you're in Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, so you're not too far, but I'm on the other side of the continent, basically, and we're sitting here talking to each other in real time.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my life, this would have been mad. This would have been an impossibility. But
the Jetsons, yeah.
And we've got this digital realm now, but we don't want to become exclusively like segregated from the real world. Like sitting here, seeing you and Robert, William, is great. I love seeing your faces, but I love it much better seeing your faces in person.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's what's happening is that I'm optimistic in the sense I believe that there is a global movement coming, that we realize we've got a very special work here that we could be doing. And it's the work of the ages. It's what when those master builders were building those incredible cathedrals, that was part of the great work. When we go back to, ancient Egypt, the building of those temples and the pyramids. I mean, we can go anywhere. We can talk about Indochina and the building of the temples in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. We can all over the world. We can go to the megalithic remains of northwestern Europe. Well, nobody's going to mistake an Egyptian take it for a Sumerian ziggurat or any of the other, come over here to the monumental earthworks of the Ohio River Valley. But underlying all of these outer manifestations of this sacred knowledge is the same template.
Mm-hmm.
They're all working from the same template, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
template we've inherited. And I really believe, like in the Masonic sense, that it is time, both figuratively and literally, to take our trowels in hand again and recommence the great work of building the holy city, which is a metaphor for the paradise we could literally create out of all the raw materials we've been given in this little sector of the universe that we inhabit. And that's what the idea that, and I know, William, I know you, I just, my instincts tell you, you are right on board with this same kind of a vision that we really are about wanting to change the world.
Mm-hmm. Truly.
And it's not a utopian fantasy that's conjured up out of nothing. It has this incredibly deep, rich pedigree to it. So, yeah, that's why I'm looking forward to May in Sedona, I guess you could say.
And what about you, William? Do you want to have a last word for the importance of coming together in Sedona?
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, it's Sedona, okay, in May. It's spectacularly gorgeous. It's absolutely stunning. And it's a great time to be there. To fly through Phoenix, drive on up to Sedona. It's awesome. And the caliber of people that attend the the events that Robert puts together are always really deep seekers, people that are have invested their life, they've invested their soul in this. This is not just a conference, it's a congregation, really. And it's a meeting of minds, and it's where people come to bring new, fresh particles of what they're working on, things that Randall and I might not even have heard of. There's so many new discoveries that are being made. That's why I love working with so many of the. I don't like the term influencers. There's got to be a better word. They're just researchers, right? They happen to know how to work social media and YouTube, and they're bringing forward new discoveries all the time. So this is a chance for not only the presenters to offer their latest research, but also to just enliven this thought sphere that Randall is talking about, this heavenly city that we're called to build, this new vibration that the kind of the spiritual people talk about, that really is about reclaiming our true history, which is what many of the researchers are about, and putting us back on a path to sustainability and indeed transformation and connection in our age of disclosure with the highest intelligences of the universe.
Cool.
I would add one more little anecdote here. Sedona. We're going to meet in Sedona. If you flip it and spell it backwards, it's anodes. Anodes, which comes from the Greek anodos, anodos, which means literally the way upward.
Oh, wow. How cool, man.
Wow.
It's so cool, Randall. I never knew that. That's awesome.
That's an interesting, yeah. So what we got out of this conversation and what we all have in common is reading books, looking into gaining your own knowledge, self-transformation, utilizing the tools at hand, which are art, math, sacred geometry, and all passed down from the ancients onto us. And we need to open our hearts and open our minds with the right kind of entheogens so we can see all this happen. And then we're initiated into the school Eleusinian to the next level. Did I get
Right
that?
on. Love it. Love it. Love it.
Pretty darn close, Robert.
Okay. Okay, BYO on the entheogens. We got Sedona and the speakers covered.
Cool, man.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, guys. Well, definitely looking forward to Sedona. We always have a good team, good time, and a good team, and we always have a good party as well. So, looking forward to hanging with you all. It usually concludes with Randall's drumming, so that'll happen in there somewhere.
Nice.
And if we're lucky, maybe William will bring up his guitar and do some solo.
You never know. You never know.
Well, William, we'll have to get together and start rehearsing. Now,
Okay, man.
We
Cool.
we got our act together.
Thank you, Randall. That's beautiful.
Okay, thank you, William.
All right,
Always-
great to see you all. See you in a
Yeah.
couple months.
Thank
Oh,
you
yeah.
to everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Randall and William, for taking the time to be here with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Really
Anytime.
enjoy it.
Thank you.